Welcome tonight. Thank you all for joining me. It's a beautiful night. So I know we all want to be outside. So I appreciate you being here instead, which is really good. We are going to be talking about Taming Anxiety Gremlins. It's a special edition because I will be talking a little bit about the autism spectrum as well, because anxiety definitely, there's some different considerations. So I wanted to add that piece. So we are going to jump right into it because I have lots of slides to kind of get through and make sure we're going here. Okay, so first, of course, looking at what anxiety is. Essentially, it's that trigger, we see something, we see some danger, and our brain is saying alert, alert, and we pretty much freeze or run away or fight. So in our brain here, you'll see that little red dot. That's our amygdala. And that's what processes emotions. And as soon as there is danger or stress, especially in our environment, it sends a signal to our amygdala. Our amygdala sets off alarms and sends out chemicals into our body. Now, generally what happens, and I'll be talking about a little bit more about the brain, but essentially the chemicals will produce blood flow and other things that are going on in our body so that we can prepare to run or whatever it is that we need to do in that moment. So we need to have that amygdala. We need to have that response. It's here to stay. We can't get rid of it. That anxiety, it's normal. It's there to protect us. It's necessary for survival. It helps us perform our best and also motivate when we have a little bit of anxiety, right? It's when it becomes so much anxiety that we can't do anything. But the big thing that we need to remember is that it is temporary, right? It's just in that moment when there is danger in front of us. Now, worries are to be expected depending on the age and developmental stage of different individuals and kids especially. So when we look at developmentally appropriate fears, when kids are first going to preschool or daycare, we are going to expect some separation anxiety. There's big transitions in life, even for us as adults. If we're moving to a new city or starting a new job, we might have a little bit of those worries. Or, of course, there's stressful experiences that can be traumatizing, like car accidents, for example, or even just new and unfamiliar situations for some people. Now, again, it's temporary. When we're looking at worries, they don't interfere with our functioning. It really is in that moment, and we're still successful in all our parts of life. So when we're looking at worries, what's the problem then? When does it become a problem? Well, those worries really were there adaptively for us when there were, saber-toothed tigers. We don't have saber-toothed tigers anymore in our life. So what's happening is it's just the stress. Even just thinking I have to make that phone call or I've got these deadlines, the brain can't tell the difference between what it actually sees and what it imagines. So just imagining the stress of work that I need to do is creating that same response in my brain and in my body as though a saber-toothed tiger really was right in front of me. So when we look at kids, right, and it doesn't matter if it's just kids, but even as adults, we just start ruminating and we get caught in this web of worries and worries and worries and worries. It turns into a vicious cycle. And with kids as well, just our own thoughts continue to worry us just by thinking it. We don't even need to see any danger. It's just thinking it. And the biggest thing, it's expecting something bad to happen. And we might not consciously think, oh my goodness, if I don't make these deadlines, all of these bad things are going to happen. But it's just that pressure, that anticipation, something bad is going to happen. Just thinking that is enough to set off alarms into our brain, sending chemicals out into our body. And what ends up happening, the hormones are released and we start feeling things in our body. Maybe our chest pain, our heart starts beating more rapidly. We can't breathe as effectively. Our kidneys, and that's where the pictures are here in the slide, the kidneys secrete stress hormones. And so what happens is we get this acid into our stomach. So then we get a stomach ache, right? So if kids are starting to feel, oh my gosh, I can't do that thing, or I can't go to school. I mean, now we don't have to go to school, but I can't go here or there because I'm not feeling well. Well, that's what's happening. It's anxiety making them not feel very well. Or, our body needs to eliminate to prepare us to run. So then maybe they need to feel like they have to go to the bathroom. I have lots of kids and young adults who feel like they always have to go to the bathroom, right? Over time, it can start creating problems for our immune system and for just the strength of our heart. So the physical symptoms are a problem, and that's usually where we get sucked in with anxiety. because we'll talk about our fears and we're like, no, it's not a big deal. But then it's like, oh, mom, I can't do this because I've got a headache or I'm sick or whatever it is. And then just worrying about those physical symptoms. I have a lot of people, and this is actually more my teenagers, young adults, who start worrying, I just can't let my heart rate elevate above 120, right? And then as soon as, and they'll wear heart monitors and sit down as soon as their heart rate is closing in on 120. So those physical symptoms become a problem as well. So I just wanted to give some stats on anxiety. It's the leading reason for children's emergency room visits and hospitalizations, just to look at the severity of this. And the World Health Organization had predicted by the year 2020, which is now, can you believe it? Like, we don't have flying cars. I can't even get it over it. But 50% of kids will have a mental illness. It's the most anxiety is the most common mental health problem in kids, school-aged kids up to grade 12. And it's not something you outgrow. So there's a lot of wait and sees, right? They'll outgrow it. But that separation anxiety trickles out of preschool into school, and it turns into other anxieties elsewhere as the kids get older. Unfortunately, when we wait and see, a lot of kids, most of them actually go without effective support until after they're a tween. The problem with that is teens and tweens and young adults are extremely susceptible to developing anxiety disorders, and anxiety usually turns to depression. And 70% of all mental health problems in adulthood began in childhood and adolescence. So this is just showing us, this is a big concern, and we can't just wait and see and hope it gets better, because it does have long-term effects. Untreated anxiety is the leading predictor of depression in teens and in young adults. Now, when we're looking at anxiety and autism, more than 40% of children do suffer from anxiety disorders, and more than half of our high-functioning adults also have pretty significant anxiety comorbidities. So that's something that we definitely need to keep in mind. So for those of you who either have a child on the spectrum or work with kids on the spectrum, we need to understand that anxiety actually worsens their symptoms and can lead to regression in skills. And that's actually true not just for autism, it's also true if we've got learning disabilities or ADHD or other things that are going on. Anxiety worsens those symptoms. And oftentimes they're not functioning at the level that they could be. It affects learning, but it also affects the interventions. So if you've got the best ABA program for autism, let's say, for example, or the best behavior strategies, the best classroom resources, whatever you put in place, none of that's going to work if anxiety is getting in the way. So anxiety definitely needs to be addressed. Anxiety also contributes to lots of irritability, aggression, self-injurious behaviors that we see. And of course, it increases family stress. And especially if you've got a kiddo who's also rigid and there's all those anxieties, it's like we're walking on eggshells. It affects important life transitions. And then, of course, the long-term risks as they enter into adulthood. So there are some special considerations when we look at the autism population. Anxiety is modified by ASD, and it doesn't fit the DSM criteria. So we really need to be careful, when we're looking at diagnosis. And that's why, when we go into diagnosis, we have to have differential diagnoses and making sure we're looking at everything that's going on. But when we're looking at anxiety, it might be a little bit different. Now, I'm not saying that this is true for all people on the spectrum. Keep that in mind. But this is something that we do need to consider. So, for example, individuals with autism often have social anxiety. Now, when we look at the DSM criteria for social anxiety, it's essentially fear of judgment. I'm worried that kids are going to laugh at me. I'm worried about being embarrassed, right? They're worried about others' appraisals of them. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes when we're looking at high-functioning autism, there's no fear of being judged. It's just, I do not like going out in social situations. It is not in my realm. It's not in my wheelhouse of comfort. So we need to look at those distinctions. Sometimes there's idiosyncratic phobia. So that's an unusual focus. And so maybe it's fear of men in hats, for example, or men with beards, right? So it's kind of those idiosyncrasies that we see in autism, and it's specifically around fears. So it's unique to this population. The special interests related to intense interest. So it could be a fear of, oh my goodness, this is a big one right now for a lot of kiddos, not just autism, fear of not having access to that thing that I love. So for a lot of kids right now, it might be their video game, for example, and it starts to develop anxiety. And that's all I can think about is, oh my goodness, I'm not going to be able to play my game. Then what, right? So that's kind of the fear around that. And then of course, fear around change. So any changes in routines or environment can be very anxiety provoking. So those are, those special considerations. They don't fit the DSM, but they are very true for a lot of people who are on the spectrum. And so when we look at the numbers, when we look at ASD and anxiety, so 37% have no anxiety, but we call these special considerations ambiguous anxiety. So you can see a large proportion have, whether it's ambiguous on its own, it's a little bit smaller, but both the DSM anxiety, so the social anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, all of these different things, and the ambiguous, that's a big proportion of our kiddos. So we need to consider those types of things. So I kind of talked about all of the prevalence of the long-term risks, but there is a silver lining here. Anxiety can be preventative, and it's the most treatable disorder without medications. So I'm glad that you're here because there's a lot of things that we could be doing to support our kiddos. I'm just going to turn my video off just to make sure that it's not interfering with anything, but I can turn it on here and there. So how anxiety manifests. The first way is through affect, so our emotion and the physical symptoms as well, right? So lots of kids with anxiety have greater sensitivity to symptoms. So the first sign of elevated heart rate, for example, they're really sensitive to that. And frequent doctor visits, especially a lot of my young adults go to the doctor all the time just to get that word, you know what, your heart's fine, you're not going to have a heart attack, right? So they're going to the doctor all the time. Or poor school attendance. I'm seeing a lot more, well, not now with COVID, but I am seeing more and more over the years, school avoidance, for example. When we look at autism, we really, again, have to disentangle what is autism versus anxiety. And this is true not just for autism, again, with ADHD or learning disability, other things like that. So when we're anxious, of course, we're going to have flat affect. Of course, we're not going to be looking at people, right? Because we are going in protection mode. We're not going to have a lot of social interaction. We want to withdraw. We want to run away. We might engage in repetitive behavior. Think of yourself when you have a nervous habit. If you're feeling worried about something, some people twirl their hair or chew their fingernails, right? They get into these sort of habits. Rigidities, we want things predictable, right? So we need to look at what is autism versus anxiety, or if it's ADHD and anxiety. When we're looking at how it manifests during our thoughts, a lot of the time they're unrealistic thoughts, a lot of what ifs, and we're always thinking the worst case scenario, right? And really, a lot of the times the world is a dangerous place. And right now I'm seeing a huge spike in anxiety because the world has been a dangerous place. Or, if there's kids who've had parents who had to go back to work, right? And are still being out there in the world. It's very, very scary. So there's a lot of this what if sort of thinking and unrealistic and worst case scenarios. A lot of the times they feel incompetent as well. So they're relying on us to reassure them. And I'm going to be talking a lot about that and just isolating themselves from the world. We also see anxiety manifest as behaviors. So we might see a lot of opposition, irritability, defiance, attention seeking. Lots of kids will start, my older ones will start self-medicating to help soothe them, right? Distractibility, rigidity, they give up easily. That's a big one for a lot of my kiddos, is they just give up so easily. And maybe you've got kiddos at home who are trying to do schoolwork and they're just giving up or trying to avoid tasks. And oftentimes it comes out behaviorally, but it's really just protecting themselves, and it's the anxiety. So those are externalizers when we've got those aggressive behaviors. But we also have our internalizers. They're the ones who withdraw. They're really quiet. They might be sad and irritable. Maybe it's more the physiological, their stomach aches and headaches, those types of things. They're just feeling tired all the time. I do have a kiddo with anxiety myself, so I do know from the clinical side of things, but also just as a mom, how hard it can be. But my one kiddo, my days that I'm busy, she's often saying she's not feeling well because she's not knowing how to do things kind of on our own so that anxiety starts to come out. And then, of course, I talked a little bit about the externalizing. We usually see them as oppositional behaviors that we need to address, but oftentimes it's actually that, you know, they're soft underbellies that they're trying to protect. That's anxiety. Actually, stealing, I just want to talk about that one. I'm seeing a lot of kids who are engaging in stealing behaviors. And we got to look at the potential anxiety. So a big one right now is actually around screens and devices. And I have a lot of kiddos who are trying to essentially steal or sneak away devices so that they can access time. And it's that underlying anxiety of, when am I going to have access to it again? So when we're looking at anxiety disorders, there's significant interference with their functioning in any situation, whether it's home or school or socially. And really, kids start behaving based on how anxiety wants them to behave. So no, anxiety doesn't want them to go to school, or doesn't want them to do their writing, or doesn't want them to go to the grocery store because they might, get COVID. And it's just causing a lot more distress than we would expect from other peers. So there's lots of risk factors, but truly everyone's predisposed to anxiety. We all have worries, just that's part of being human, and we're all predisposed to anxiety. But we got to look at our environment and what's contributing to that. So if we look at, by the time they're 11, kids have seen over 8,000 murders, 100,000 other acts of violence just on TV. And so the problem with that, even just looking at social media, we're kind of creating this world of anxiety where kids are being exposed to fearful things, but even things like social media, the worry of, oh my gosh, is my post going to get a like? Or someone's posted something, maybe about me, or their, friends are going to a party or things like that. And they're just checking. There is a lot of research showing when you have a Facebook account, for example, a social media account, people are more anxious, less happy, and they actually have lower grades. Excuse me. So, I always look back at the olden days. I wasn't back there then. I'm old, but not that old. When we had these villages, right? And people didn't know what was happening from one village to the next unless someone kind of paddled down the river or ran to say, hey, we're being ransacked, watch out, protect yourselves, or there's a big storm coming. We really didn't know what was happening outside of our village. But now with the news, kids are exposed to everything that's happening around the world. And kids have a hard time figuring out what is real or what is not. It can be really difficult to see a tsunami that's happening on the other side of the world and not understand that's not going to affect them, right? And now I think it's just elevated with everything that's going on with COVID, that we did see what was going on the other side of the world, and now all of a sudden it came here and it's affecting us. So I think it's just really going to instill what I see on the news. And of course the news is just, it's all about the negative, right? That's what stimulates our brain and gets us going. We're attracted to those types of things, and kids just kind of eat it up. But over time, and even, teenagers and young adults, all of us actually, if we're predisposed to anxiety, we really start worrying and we get caught up in everything that's going around the world. So again, research has shown that with no exception, all screen time is linked to less happiness. So the more screen time we get, and this isn't just for children, it's also for adults, it increases our feelings of loneliness, depression, and even suicidal thinking. So we really need to look at how much screen time, our kids are getting, and even for ourselves. This is my biggest worry of COVID. It's everything that I've been talking about. I've done parenting challenge and lots of different activities. And this is the number one thing I'm worried about, is what screens are doing to our kids during COVID. Because I know even my girls are getting way more screen time than they ever had before, just because school's online. So they're having to do a lot more. So when we're looking at brain networks, stress shrinks our brain networks. So you can see the normal networks, and then when we're stressed, it kind of cuts communication off. So all youth and young adults are already at an increased predisposition to stress, and their stress responses are increased as well. So they're just a lot more vulnerable. And this is true for all teenagers and young adults, not just with a diagnosis. So any kind of stress can affect their learning. They're definitely at risk for developing anxiety disorders and other health problems, and even just emotional trauma and stress-induced illnesses. I mean, we see a lot of illnesses going around because the immune system is weakened. And actually, the stress changes brain development, and it's irreversible, right? So it's harder. If you're an adult who struggles with anxiety, you've probably tried lots of different strategies and nothing has really been that effective. And the reason is, if we wait too long, these changes to our brain can be irreversible, or it's just a lot harder. So the teenage brain is really powerful, and this is a great time to make sure that we're intervening, but it's definitely at its vulnerable time. Then, if you also have a young adult or a teenager with autism, they're at even greater risk. And actually, even any child with any executive functioning difficulties, so it's autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, anything like that, 98% of these populations do experience increased stress from individuals who don't have any diagnoses at all. So there's a lot more stressors in life, in all areas of life, especially if you have something like autism or ADHD, and they're not able to meet societal expectations, right? Whether it's socially, interpersonally, with other people, academically, or at work, in anything that they do. And as they get older, there's really a lot of gaps in services. So they're not getting the support and resources that they need. So it's just adding to the stress as well. So that's kind of a background. So let's start getting into the things that we're doing. When we look at what is anxiety, I always say it's we get sucked into something, whatever that thing is. We think this is just too much and I can't handle it, right? We get so overwhelmed. I can't handle it. And that's the big message that anxiety tells us. But oftentimes we are making mistakes as parents or caregivers. We fall into a lot of traps. So now's our chance. I always say that there's a disclaimer. I didn't put the disclaimer here, but if you want to leave now, I always say ignorance is a bliss, especially if you're a parent, because I always say, here's your baby and 5 pounds of guilt compounded daily for the rest of your life, because we're always feeling guilty. If you don't want to feel any more guilt, then you can leave now. I warned you. The first thing, kids learn anxious behaviors from the other adults in their life, and parents are a big portion of their life, but also teachers and other people that they see as well. But they learn these behaviors. The other trap that we fall into is we use catastrophic language. And so what that means is, you know, we can say, hey kiddo, and I could say this to my youngest daughter, but I couldn't say it to my older daughter, you know, hey kiddo, make sure you lock the door. We should just end it there. I'm going out to the store, lock the door behind me. But we don't. We add, you better lock the door because otherwise someone's going to break in and they're going to steal all our stuff and snatch you away, right? So we add this catastrophic language. We sometimes have too many expectations for our kids. We expect too much, and that increases their stress. And it's not just our expectations, it's also them perceiving that we expect too much. So even if you think, well, I don't expect straight A classes, even if they think that you do, that's really, you know, that causes a lot of stress. Rushing reinforces anxiety. So if you're rushing, maybe it's not so bad now with COVID, but if you think pre-COVID days, rushing out the door to get the kids to school or you to work, that reinforces anxiety. Sometimes we will ask leading questions. So for example, let's say your kiddo has trouble at the playground, you know, at recess time at school. And you're asking, hey, how was recess time at school, right? You're asking, probing, checking in to see how they were doing. Or we're answering their questions. A lot of kiddos or young adults with anxiety will ask, what about this? Who's going to be there? What time are you going to be home? What's going to happen here? Bah, 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 bah. What time are we? Blah, 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 blah. There's lots of questions and we get sucked into the content. Sometimes we're like, this is going to be the best thing ever. I was a parent, you know, we went to one of the parent jamboree classes and there's the parachute and we're like, oh my gosh, go into the parachute. It's going to be so much fun. And we're pushing our kids while they're screaming. That's not helpful at all. So those are some of the things that we do For my older kids, I find, especially my teenagers, I find this can be really damaging when we blame genetics and brain chemicals. And we say things like, you know what, they come by it honestly, we're an anxious family, or he was always anxious, he was always sensitive, right? They start to ingrain, this is who I am. And that's a big problem, because when we look at anxiety, we need to separate ourselves from that. The other thing is we reassure our kids. It's not a big deal, bud. Everything's going to be okay. Or don't worry, you know, no one's going to break into the house. But what happens if someone does break into the house? They've now lost trust in us and just reinforced their idea that the world's a safe place and you're not safe because you don't believe it either. And you're just minimizing their feelings, right? We really need to help validate. So we got to remember, when the brain is stressed out, that amygdala kicks in. And what essentially happens is all the blood rushes. Actually, I'm going to put my video on. I feel like I'm more effective sometimes with my video. All the brain, so up here in our prefrontal cortex is our human thinking brain, where we make good decisions, right? That's where we can think rationally, think, okay, it's not really that big of a deal, right? We can calm down. All of those functions are in this part of the brain. But when the brain gets stressed, the amygdala takes over, sends out the alarms, and essentially all the blood rushes out of that part of the brain into the motor cortex. And then all the blood rushes to our big muscles so that we can run away or fight, right? So this is literally offline because all of the blood has rushed away. And so when we're trying to tell our kids, don't worry, calm down, it's not a big deal, they're not listening anyways. They can't take that information in, right? It's essentially a stop sign for rational thinking. So it's going in one ear and out the other. They can't learn, they can't remember. The brain just seeks pleasure and it stops trying, and it goes into that fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? It's just a stop sign. When we look at anxiety, it wants certainty, it wants predictability, and it wants comfort. And so if we're giving any of those things, like by answering their questions, we're giving certainty and predictability, right? And then we're comforting. It's okay. It's not a big deal. Everything's going to be okay. The more we talk about it and do those things, we're actually making anxiety worse. We're making that anxiety feel really important. And we're reinforcing the idea you can't handle it. I need to be there to help support you, right? So as soon as we're jumping in to help them, it's changing brain development. Kids can't make those problem-solving connections on their own. They can't make those rationalizing connections on their own. Their confidence is stunted because we're always in there jumping in and helping them. And then their learning is limited, especially if we're trying to rationalize things and it's going in one ear or another. That anxiety just becomes ingrained. The other thing is, I'm doing a lot of work on resilience. And when we look at the key ingredients of resilience, they need stress. To be resilient, they need stress. They need risk. They need adversity. So I think a lot of those kiddos in like inner city Bronx who are growing up in, gangs and gun wars and all of these things are probably a lot more resilient than a lot of our kiddos who are out in Springbank, for example, right? And I'm going to be getting into some of this as well, but kids need to have risk and adversity to build resilience. 90% of kids and adults successfully decrease their anxiety through lifestyle changes that foster empowerment and confidence and independence. And if we're always there cushioning everything, they're never able to develop those things. I actually just think of Rachel from Friends, who, the very first pilot episode, she comes running into the coffee shop with her wedding dress and she's all upset. And she's like, I need money from daddy. I've never been independent before, right? So we want to give our kids everything, but then, she had to learn how to do her laundry. She did learn and become stronger, but in those times, she was a fully grown adult, ready to get married, and could not do a single thing for herself. So we got to be careful of that. We need to give them opportunities for building these things. So assertiveness training is certainly important, but we need to create opportunities for them to be able to assert themselves. And when you do, if you think of conflict situations where you've had to go, and maybe, it was an argument with, or something you had to deal with at work, with a coworker, or with a spouse, or anything like that, leading up to those conversations can feel sickening. Like you could feel like you need to throw up. But then once you do have those conversations, the brain usually feels pretty good, right? So when we're able to assert ourselves, it helps decrease a lot of that stress response. And then we have the experience of mastery. And even small kids can do it, identifying and expressing their feelings. Young kids, we want to get them doing that, you know, and asking for help. So all this to say, we've got all of these parent traps. What do we do now? I always say anxiety is a family affair, especially, you know, I work with a lot of teens and young adults, and parents are like, you know, can I be involved? I've worked with people before, psychologists before, and we're never allowed in the room. Absolutely. You have to be in the room. You have to be there. If not for a full session or whatever the work you're doing, you are a major part of that work. So it's definitely a family affair. Or if you are a professional who works or supports families, you got to make sure parents are involved. Even my university students, I get parents involved. It's really important. Now, again, we got to start with ourselves. So whether we're working with kids or they're our own kids, we need to think about how we're modeling anxiety, right? And how we respond as well, because that makes all the difference. Again, rushing really reinforces that anxiety. Stress and anxiety are contagious. So if we are stressed, we've got this emotion contagion going on where our kids are going to be stressed as well. And if we're freaking out and yelling and, oh my gosh, where's my phone? I got my keys and I've got a call. If we start yelling and freaking out, we're not helping our kids learn how to problem solve. The other thing is about opportunities, and you'll hear me say this word over and over again. Playgrounds didn't look quite like this when I was a kiddo, but man, that would have been amazingly fun. But certainly I had 12 feet poles that dropped right down to sheer rocks, and the wooden playgrounds where you get the huge splinter in your hand, right? You learned really fast how to be careful. But now the playgrounds are so soft and cushy, like no wonder kids are scared. They've never had the opportunity to actually hurt themselves to realize that's not a big deal if I fall and scrape my knee, right? Because everything is so soft and cushy. Even just our language, right? We say, be careful, they're climbing a tree. Oh, you know, even we don't even have to say anything. It's just our actions like, oh my goodness, we're telling our kids, I don't trust you to be able to do that. You can't do it. You got to be careful. We're always telling them this. You know, careful around the stove. They're never going to learn until, I'm not saying we got to go burn our kids' hands, but that's how they learn, is through experience of burning their hand, to be careful. Us telling them all the time is just essentially saying, you don't know how to handle it, right? And again, the language that we're using, we really need to be careful. And even how we deal with our own anxieties and even slight embarrassments. Now, normally I do this in a big group of people, and I'm going to ask you to do it. I'm going to keep my video on for this, and I want you, I'm not going to stand up because I'm in my underwear. No, I'm totally not in my underwear. I'm actually wearing shorts. I'm not going to stand up though, because I do have a desk and it's going to be awkward, but I will do it sitting down. I want you to dance with me, okay? And you're probably going to roll your eyes and you're going to skip over this part. And if you're going to watch the video later, you're going to maybe fast forward. But these are the kinds of things when we're put in situations and we're like, no, it's okay, right? This is your opportunity to actually just engage and get over yourself and kind of play along. So if you didn't know who these guys are, you probably do now. Okay, I got to back up a little bit. Dance with me. And I do this in a big group with everybody. We'll do one more. Hopefully you're doing it, because otherwise I just look like a big fool. Okay. So part of that, oh, I'm just going to move on. Okay. Hopefully you did it with me. I bet only like maybe 1% of you did, or 0.25 of you did. When I do it in a big group, there's of course some parents who are like, oh, and then they just half-hearted. But by the end, everyone's smiling. So music and dancing is a nice little stress relief. And so that's why I throw it in there. A, what are you modeling to your kids? But B, just giving you different ideas that music and dancing can be that stress relief. Okay, so that's the first thing, is taking care of ourselves and how are we responding? The second and most important thing, actually, probably more than anything, is we got to get their buy-in. So I gave that example of the kids who, or the parents who would throw their kids under the parachute, for example, like it's going to be so much fun. They didn't get their kids buy-in, right? The kid wasn't like, oh yeah, okay. They were shoved in. It was terrifying, and pulled out. It was terrifying. So we need to get their buy-in, especially for like young adults and teenagers. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of resistance, because what we're asking them to do is scary, or very anxiety provoking, that it's making them feel very uncomfortable. They feel like they got to go to the bathroom. They feel like they're going to throw up, right? And that scariness and that discomfort outweighs anything else. So we got to make sure that we have their buy-in, so they're willing. I'm willing to be uncomfortable and to go through that process for whatever is on the other side. You know, sometimes it's enough. You know what? I just want to be able to go to a sleepover successfully because I keep getting left out. So sometimes it's their own motivation, right? Or I just want to make good choices. I feel like I'm always making bad choices and always making mistakes all the time, right? So sometimes it's that, or maybe it's to have fun. And sometimes, you know, if we have to give them Smarties and that's their money, then that's okay, right? Just to get that ball rolling so that they can have some experience. And we essentially need confidence over anxiety, and they're never going to have confidence unless they have that experience. So we need to have their buy-in to be willing to have that experience in the first place. So that's really important. We also need to teach about anxiety. Like I said, blaming genetics is not helpful, because that just leads to pessimism about recovery. There's nothing I can do about it. It's who I am, right? So we need to teach that we can change our brain. We can change our genetics, right? And then it's like, oh, okay, that's amazing. So again, it's that confidence. So teaching them everything that I've already talked about. Anxiety is normal. And anxiety does a really good job to really make you feel like you're going to throw up, or to really overwhelm you, or to really make this a big deal. But it's totally predictable and totally treatable. We know that we can do this. Again, talking about that amygdala, and even with little kids, I say this is our amygdala in our brain. It's the size and shape of an almond. It's our alarm system, right? Anytime we think something scary or think a worry, it's going to set off all these false alarms in our bodies. Humans are the only ones who can think about the future, and that's usually where anxiety comes from, or maybe something that we've done, but usually it's we've done something and we're worrying about the consequence still to come. So we're worrying about that anticipation of something bad happening. And again, it blocks this rational thinking part of our brain, because all the blood is rushed out of it. And our brain can't tell the difference if we're just thinking something scary or if something really is actually scary. And our body is still going to respond as though something scary is actually happening. So we want to teach about all of that. And then when the alarm's rung, our adrenal glands send out the adrenaline to our body to get us ready to fight or run. And then we're stuck in this vicious cycle, right? And then we've got these physical symptoms, and those physical symptoms are just making us worried more, right? Because it's like, see, it is a big deal because I'm sick. I really can't go to school, or whatever it is. So we got to remember that anxiety really is physical. So we need to be able to recognize it in the body, right? And that's an important part. Of course, you've got a headache. That makes sense. That's what anxiety wants you to have, right? So that you don't feel like you can't go to school. So when we understand what anxiety is, how it shows up, and how it shows up in our body, now we can have more adaptive, rational thinking, because the mystery is gone, right? Now I know what's happening. I'm not actually going to throw up. That's just what anxiety wants me to think about. So we can say, of course you feel uncomfortable. That makes sense. No wonder your adrenal glands are sending all these chemicals out to your body. Of course you feel sick, right? Then we can talk like that. Then kids can start talking themselves. I understand what's happening in my body. This is why I feel like I need to go to the bathroom. And you know what? I can handle this. I can handle what my body does. I can handle this discomfort. That's essentially where we need to get them to do. I know I can handle it. And we got to start expecting physical sensations. And when we do, just by expecting it, okay, when anxiety shows up, I know I feel like I need to throw up. Right? And I will have kids make predictions. Okay, my anxiety is going to show up at 8 o'clock tonight, and it's going to make me feel like I got to go to the bathroom. It's going to make me feel like I can't breathe. It's going to make me feel like I'm really thirsty and I need some water. Those are the things that it's going to happen. Just by expecting that changes our relationship with anxiety, and it actually helps reduce the stress levels in our body and the amount of hormones and everything else going up. So when we talk about anxiety, the big thing that you know, in my early days, I forgot to say that the anxiety just won't go away. We can't turn the alarm off. We might help reduce it a little bit just by predicting the anxiety is going to come, but we can't get rid of the worry or the feelings. They're still going to be there. That discomfort is still going to be there. Just by saying, oh, I knew you were coming, we're still going to feel anxious, right? But we can say, ah, that's anxiety, but you know what? I'm still going to go to my sleepover, or I'm still going to do this hard thing, and we're ready for it. Ah, I knew you were going to show up at 8 o'clock tonight, but you know what? I have a plan. So that's kind of the difference. And I already kind of alluded to this. Part of what we're teaching is the neuropsychology of the brain. So essentially, we can change our brain, right? We can change our thoughts and all of those types of things. So one thing that I always caution is our thoughts are not trustworthy, because we have a lot of thoughts going through our head, and especially when we start thinking of what if, or I'm in trouble, or I've done something bad, and we start to believe them. We believe a lot of our thoughts, even though our thoughts are not trustworthy. Okay, so I do this quiz again. It's always interesting when I have a big group, but think to yourself, what color is a yield sign? Think of a color. Now, I know some of you have said yellow, but guess what? It's red and white. If you're older, you probably said yellow. Younger people would have said red and white, because there was a time when yield signs were yellow, right? But things change, even things that were truth. Just because we still believe it doesn't mean it's still true. And so I like to do this exercise so that we can start to see how our thoughts are not always trustworthy. So it's always interesting. You can make a list of things that either you or others believed, or people in the world believe that, you know, we don't believe anymore. So for example, there was a time where people believed that the earth was flat, right? There was a time, and apparently there's still more people. There was a time when I was in school, Pluto was a planet, and now we know it's not actually a planet. Things change, even in science. So just for fun, quickly answer to yourself, true or false? Chameleons change color for protection, to hide from predators. Or people will say to hide from predators, or to catch food, to hunt. It's actually false. They change color so they can communicate with each other, and so they can maintain a certain body temperature. Okay, how much of our brain do we use? Most people believe it's about 10%, and that's what Hollywood would want us to believe, right? Even Inception, I was watching Inception the other day, and they say, you know, we only use a fraction of our brain while we're awake, but we tend to use more of it when we're sleeping, or anything with metahumans and superpower strengths. They say normal people only use about 10% of their brain, but these metahumans with superpowers, they use all of their brain. But guess what? We do actually use almost all of our brain. Okay. What do camels store in their humps? Most people will say water, but it's fat. And if you knew that, good for you. But a lot of people think water. I always thought water until I actually started doing these presentations. How long does it take for your gum to digest if you swallow it? Now, old school, I was taught 7 years. It stays in your stomach for 7 years, but it's not even a week, right? So these are the types of things. Okay, so for this one, so you can make those lists of things that people believe. Not only are thoughts untrustworthy, we can also show our kids that our eyes can trick our brain as well. So for this one, I want you to stare at the cross, the plus sign in the very middle, and just keep staring at that. Now, as you stare, you might see a green dot going around the circle. But guess what? There's no green dot there at all. It's just our eyes it's not liking the misplaced circles, because essentially all it's doing is each circle is taking a turn of disappearing. And so as it moves, our brain fills in that empty dot with the green dot. So that's essentially what's happening there. Let's see if I can move on to the next slide. Oops. Okay, this one, I know your rational smarty pant brain knows the answer to this, but when you look at these pictures, which orange dot actually looks bigger? You would probably say the one on the right with these smaller dots around it, right? It looks bigger, even though we know if we were to put them overlapping each other, they're exactly the same size. But again, it's just another example of how our eyes are tricking us. Okay, for this one, I want you to stare at right under the eye. There's this little red and green dot here. I want you to stare there. And I'll tell you when to switch. So just keep staring at that little dot. When I say go, not yet, keep staring there. But when I say go, you're going to move your eyes over to the X to the right. But keep holding on just another few seconds. Okay, now look over to the X. Hopefully you would have saw the color version of the picture. It's pretty amazing what our eyes and our brain can do, right? I'll leave it up for another second. But these are the types of things that you can be doing with your kids, right? Where we can teach not only our thoughts aren't trustworthy because things change, but our eyes aren't always trustworthy too. Our eyes can trick our brain. First glance, what do you think this is? Probably say a parrot. It's actually a woman who's painted. If you look carefully, her arm is up above her head with her hand down below the back of her head. Then her arm, her knee sticking up towards her chest with her foot pointed down, and then her other leg is pointing straight down. So it's pretty interesting. You can, again, show these to your kids. This is always a fun one. So you got to see which way is the ballerina turning. Is she turning right or left? Or for the lucky folks out there, you can see her changing directions. She has only ever turned left for me. I have never seen her turn any other way. But for a lot of people, actually I had a kiddo today who I was showing this to. He's like, oh, she's changing. Oh, she's changing again. Oh, she's changing again. We're all looking at the same thing. Mom can see her turning one way and I can see her turning the other way. It's just our eyes. So you want to do these things. And I like ending off here. Take a look. Can you see a white triangle? The answer is probably yes, you can see a white triangle, but there's actually no triangle there. Our brain, it's just adult psychology, our brain likes to see the full picture. It doesn't like incomplete designs. And so you can see the triangle, the black outline of the triangle is incomplete, and the black circles are incomplete. So our brain fills in the gaps. Okay, so I like to give a little story. Actually, I stole this from Brene Brown, but it just is a good example of how our brain fills in the gaps. So let's say you're watching a movie, and we'll say it's over the holidays. So it's snowy, and it's really festive, and there's a family in the car. The mom and dad are in the front seat, and they're singing Christmas carols. Their kids are in the back seat singing Christmas carols. Everyone's looking at each other, happy. They're so excited. They're going to drive to Grandma and Grandpa's house out in the country to have a big country Christmas dinner. And so they're all bouncing along, singing, looking, and then the camera pans out of the car back, and all you see is the car driving down the highway, and it's snowing, it's beautiful. What happens next? First reaction. Most people will say accident, crash, deer hit, something as bad is going to happen, right? That's where our brain goes. It fills in the gaps with the worst case scenario. And it's an adaptive function. It's to protect us, right? So that we can stay safe. But that's what ends up happening. So if you've ever experienced, maybe you've done an email to someone or texted someone and you didn't get a response right away. And then you're like, oh my gosh, they're mad at me. What did I do? I need to call them. And we start making this big deal out of it. And then it ended up being nothing. They couldn't find their phone. They just didn't get to their email or whatever it is, right? But that's what our brain does. And so what do we call stories that are filled with fear? Because that's essentially what it is. We call them conspiracy theories, right? So when our amygdala likes to fill in our gaps, we have these conspiracy theories. So that's where our thoughts start manifesting these unrealistic, extreme things. Mom and dad are late. They must have died in a car accident, right? Or my work has to be perfect because otherwise people are going to think I'm stupid. And sometimes we send those messages too. You know, I remember there's lots of times where I burn dinner and I will say, oh, I'm so stupid because I'm trying to do 20 million things. That's my ADHD kicking in. I'm trying to do 20 million things. And then I'll slip out something like, I'm so stupid. And so that message that I'm telling my kids is I didn't get dinner perfect, therefore I'm dumb. So we got to be careful even with those little messages. So then they're thinking, oh my gosh, my work needs to be perfect. Otherwise, mom's going to think I'm dumb, right? So this is what starts happening. I'm going to throw up at school tomorrow. I can't catch a ball. So, you know, there's all of these thoughts. Everyone's going to laugh at me, right? And so we start avoiding, and that's where that anxiety starts to create problems. Now, usually when I talk about these conspiracy theories, again, I'm going to steal from Brene Brown. I love Brene Brown. I'm going to steal from her again. She talks about the shitty first draft, right? Or we can call with kids the stormy first draft or the scary first draft. That's what our amygdala does. It creates a scary first draft because it fills it in to try to protect us. But really, it's just causing more problems than not. So we got to recognize, okay, that's the first draft of this story. So I wrote that email to my boss, didn't get a response back. My first story is I'm going to be fired. What is my second, third, fourth, fifth? There's probably 10 different possibilities, right? That we can sit back. We just need to take the time, but we need to create space between ourselves and that first scary story. So when we're looking at our thoughts, they often fall. There's lots of different kind of distorted thinking patterns, right? The rigid, all or nothing, and especially if you've got a kiddo on the spectrum or with ADHD, right? We've got a lot of these sort of avoidant, rigid types of thoughts. But we need to recognize, yep, that's the story that anxiety always wants to tell me. Nice first story, right? Nice conspiracy. But this is normal. You're pretty predictable. You're annoying because it's the same story over and over again. You're always telling me something I did wrong, something I'm going to get in trouble for, something I'm going to get laughed at. It's a boring story, right? But I'm learning to control, you know, my understanding that you are just a thought. So we can start shifting our relationship with anxiety. You know, this feeling isn't great. I feel very uncomfortable, but I'm learning about what's happening to my body. And you know what? I can handle it. And it's going to be temporary. I'm just going to let my body do its thing because it's temporary. You know, and I can't be anxious, but I can still go and do my sleepover. Even though I'm feeling this way, I can still go do that and see if I can have fun. This is an emergency, right? I felt this way before, and I know that I can do it again. When we're looking at all or nothing, thinking that's the never, always, no matter what, nothing's going to change. No one likes me. No one loves me. I can't do anything right. It's all or nothing, right? It either has to be perfect or I'm an absolute failure. But I like breaking things into parts, right? You know, no matter what, if we break it into parts, there's good parts, there's bad parts, there's parts where we are perfect. There are parts where we do make mistakes. This part was hard, but this part was, you know, not so bad. So it's focusing on one step at a time. So I'm going to take you know, just a look at school, for example, because I hear, especially right now, I'm hearing a lot of, I hate school. And it's that all or nothing, all school sucks. Or writing sucks, right? Or math, whatever it is. But when I look, okay, when we break it down, all these parts of school, does all of school suck? Let's break it down. What about recess? Well, no, recess is fun. What about lunchtime? Well, no, lunch is fun. What about your friends? Well, no, you know, my friends don't suck. Well, what about teachers? Well, some teachers suck. Okay, so let's break those up. There's some teachers who aren't great and some teachers that you love. So then they realize, you know what? There's some really good parts about school. I actually really like gym. I really like art. I really like science. It's maybe just writing that's hard. So then we go to writing. Okay, what about writing? What about it? And it's, well, coming up with ideas. Well, how can we come up with ideas? Let's just talk about it, right? We can brainstorm in different ways. I can follow templates. I can edit. There's all of these things that we can do to break it down from that all or nothing. So that's one strategy that we need to start doing when we've got all of those things. So it's really bringing us to teaching skills, right? And the first thing we need to teach is to externalize. You are not your anxiety. And that's why I find those messages of genetics is really problematic, because Kids just, I was born this way. There's nothing I can do. That's not helpful. We need to externalize it. It's our amygdala. I like to use Gremlins as a great example because, in this form, he's really soft and cuddly and actually is looking out for us, right? Is kind of protective. That's the good worries, right? But when we feed them at the wrong time, what happens? They turn into these nasty, mischievous creatures. Now, with younger kids, I would not necessarily, I would not show this picture to a younger child. Maybe for older children. Younger kids, I might use How to Train Your Dragon, for example, where everybody was trying to get rid of the dragons, thought they were awful, horrible, and then Hiccup learned, hey, wait a second, we can train them and we can actually make it helpful. And that's essentially what we're doing, is how can we use our amygdala to our advantage? Now, I often talk about these gremlins as tricksters, right? And in the movies, they were photocopying their butts, right? And they were throwing big parties and making a mess in the movie theater. Yes, they were causing a lot of destruction and things, but they were tricksters. They were kind of mischievous, right? And that's what our amygdala does. It's mischievous and kind of creates all of these alarms. So if we externalize it, it's just like if we have any medical diagnosis. As soon as we can name it, then we can tame it, right? Now we know the things that we need to do to address this, right? And so that's what we want to do. So if we pull out that worry and give it a name, how are we going to do? So when is this worry going to show up? When is Gremlin going to show up? Okay, at 8 o'clock tonight, bedtime. So I always get scared at bedtime, right? When your Gremlin shows up, and I always have them name it. Even my adults, I will have them draw their little worry. I draw my little gremlin and they draw theirs and we name it. Sometimes they just want to keep anxiety. Sometimes they just want to keep their amygdala, but sometimes I've got Alice or Bob, right? Or Bad Seed or Scaredy Cat. I've got all of these names. So when Bob shows up, what does it do? Well, it makes me feel sick and I have to go to the bathroom and I feel like I can't breathe and I can't drink, I need water because my throat is parched. Okay, so what story does it say? What is the conspiracy theory? Well, it tells me, I can't have the light off because something scary is going to jump out from under my bed or right? What parts are helpful or not helpful and how are you going to respond, right? So it's when it's going to show up, not if it's going to show up, it's when it is. And so then at 8 o'clock, oh yeah, look, my tummy's hurting. This is the story that I'm worried about. We're changing our relationship with it because now we're playing offense. Now, there were 3 rules with the gremlins. One was to not get them wet because then they multiply, not to feed them at the wrong time after midnight because they turn into those mischievous creatures. The third was not to expose it to light. But that's exactly what we want to do with gremlins. We need to say, hey, I recognize what is going on here. Anxiety is, it's like a cult leader. It wants to hide away. Nobody knows when they're in a cult, right? And cult leaders don't necessarily know that they're cult leaders, but they definitely don't want their followers to know that they're in a cult, right? And so that's the same thing with anxiety. It doesn't want everyone to know that they are part of this anxiety cult. So we got to expose it for what it is, right? Because it wants to make everything a crisis and it wants you to cater to me, to make me not go to school or give me comfort and certainty and all of those types of things. So we want to make sure that we're exposing anxiety for what it is. So reminding kids or our young adults or teens, I say kids, but it incorporates everybody, how anxiety works. Yep. That's Bob. That's what he does. He's really working hard. He's really upping the ante with your, if it is starting to increase, and normally when we start doing this, it does start to increase. We can say, wow, it's really increasing its ante, really creating crazy new stories for you, right? It really is knowing how to freak you out. These are the types of things that we can say, yeah, we knew that this was going to happen. So after we externalize, we need to have kids tolerate the discomfort and not knowing, because that's essentially what leads to the avoidant behaviors and even aggressive behaviors, right? To try to avoid those situations because they don't like feeling uncomfortable and not knowing what's going to happen. But again, we got to get on offense. That's what we're doing here. Because right now, what most of us end up doing is we wait for anxiety to show up and then we're trying to respond. So we're playing on the defense. We're trying to tell kids, just breathe. We're giving them all these strategies reactively. But it's a matter of getting on offense. We knew you were coming. Anxiety, right? So again, when we know anxiety is going to show up, we know when it's going to show up. And even if he comes a little bit early, it's not really that strange. We knew around this time Bob was going to show up. But we're going to do the opposite of what it wants. right? Bob usually wants us to sit and cuddle you until you fall asleep. We're going to do the opposite. And you are too, right? You're going to do something else. And so kids need to think, I'm willing to be uncomfortable and not know how it works out over and over and over. I'm willing to do this because if I'm uncomfortable, it's going to be temporary. It's going to go away. And if I'm uncomfortable, that means I'm on the right track. That means I'm actually targeting this anxiety because as soon as I feel relief, if I avoid, I'm only just making my anxiety worse. So when you've got that buy-in, then we can say, you know what, I am on the right track because I'm changing my brain. I'm strengthening my brain. I'm retraining my brain to reset the alarm system. Right now, the alarm system is really sensitive and will go off at the drop of a dime. So I'm going to reset my alarm system to make it a little bit sturdier, right? I can, and I want to be able to do it. So if I'm uncomfortable, I know I'm on the right track and growing. So we want to make sure that they're doing all of those types of things. I don't know why I'm stuck in a loop here. Okay, so then we got to have kids thinking about what story do you want to buy into, right? So maybe it's writing it out, having that visual, because anxiety is really good to make us forget our goals. Because especially when those physical symptoms come up, we just get stuck. Oh my gosh, there's the anxiety I just got to avoid. But if we've got that visual reminder, oh yes, this is why I'm willing to be uncomfortable. I want to go to that party, right? I want to be part of the play, so I'm willing to do the audition or going on the trip. I mean, none of those things are relevant right now, but for whatever you can start working on, right? Writing those types of things out. So, oh yeah, that's why I want to go do this thing. We can use past successes, right? What are things that you've already done or learned in the past, right? I use skating as an example. You weren't born just knowing how to skate. You were probably scared the first time you strapped on those skates. You might have laid down the whole time, like my daughter, for, well, actually, it wasn't the first time, it was probably 3 months, you know, doing snow angels on the ice before she actually got up and started skating. But now look, wow, you're doing crossovers and you can go backwards crossovers and you're doing all of these amazing things. So being able to use those, right, that you've done, you strengthened your brain and your body to be able to do those things. What was the uncertainty there, right? So you want to get out of the crisis. We want to get out of this avoidance and talk about this is what worry says. And you know what? This is what I'm going to say back to it. Thanks, Bob, but no thanks. You're not really helping me out today. Once we have that toleration, we got to work on problem solving and flexibility, especially when we're looking at kiddos with executive functioning deficits like autism or ADHD. They can be really rigid in their thinking, right? So we need to have them problem solving. So even though I'm afraid of this is why I should try. This is how I'm going to keep anxiety from standing in my way. I can't stop anxiety. Again, you got to remember those feelings and thoughts are still going to be there, but I'm not going to let those feelings and thoughts get in my way of achieving my goal. So we need to help kids and young adults become independent problem solvers to figure things out without having to call us or texting us or having accommodations or crutches to join in. So it's the fear of the unknown, this problem solving. What if, you know, I do feel like I have to throw up? What if I go to the grocery store and someone does have COVID and I touch the same thing? What if, you know, you get into a car accident and die? What if, and they can go on and on and on, right? Sometimes they're really big things that we can't necessarily problem solve, but oftentimes it is things that we can try to figure out, even the COVID example. But we can't know for sure. So don't reassure your kids because we can't know for sure, right? There's the possibility you might go to a grocery store and touch something and you know, something that someone had COVID with. It might happen. We might not necessarily say those things. We won't, because we don't want to, you know, trigger anything even further, but we're not going to stop and reassure them that it's never going to happen, right? It's about, okay, let's figure that out. What if that happens? Okay, what could you do? Well, I can make sure I wear gloves and throw them out right away. I'm going to wash my hands as I go in and out. And actually, I'm just going to bring some sanitizer with me. So every time I touch something, I can, right? So they can start problem solving. As soon as we start telling them, we are creating dependency on us because they're not thinking things through themselves. We're not making those connections. And guess what? Side hint, if you're working on homework and schoolwork and math and writing, if you're always telling your kids what to do, they're not creating those connections of what to do. They need to think about what they're going to do. How am I going to get started on this project? How am I going to address the situation if I'm out in the public? How am I going to, you know, respond to my friend that I've just had a fight with? What what can you do? I love sharing this video. He's calling out. There's two people stuck on this escalator, and it's stopped. We're trapped here. And then the woman will go, help, you know, and I don't have a cell phone, and they're just exasperated that they're stuck on this escalator. Now, I love showing this video to kids because kids will just say, well, why won't they just get off the escalator? They're so stupid, right? And at the end of this, a little maintenance guy does come, but he gets stuck on his escalator. So now all three of them are stuck, and they just sit on this escalator for hours at a time. And yeah, kids can see the problem, and they can see the solution. And they're like, why don't they just do that? And oftentimes it's the same thing for our kiddos. We can see the solution, but they are stuck. And by telling them, just get off the escalator is not helpful, because they're going to need us to be there to save them every time they're stuck on that escalator. So that's why I like showing this video, is because sometimes the solution to the problem might seem obvious to us, but it's not for them. And so they're waiting for other people to help them. They really need to get off themselves and figure that out. So having a problem-solving flowchart. I mean, I really do need to make one specific for anxiety. This is, you know, my lazy man work, finding one on the internet. But essentially, you know, can I do this or this? Yes or no? And if yes or no, then what are my next steps? So that they can start following that flowchart themselves. But they are the ones who have to come up and create this, or you can collaborate with them to create it. But, you know, if we're always telling them, they'll never start thinking of those steps themselves. I love this, you know, so let's say they have a situation. I'm going to use the sleepover as an example. So if you've got a kiddo who's afraid of having sleepovers, you know, there's always lots of questions. You answering their questions is just filling up their answer bank. It's actually not helping them problem solve anything or figure out anything. So have them write what they know and start answering questions for themselves. So I know my friend's name, and I know his mom, and I know his house, and he's got a dog, and I'm going to bring my own pillow so I don't have to worry about that. And I know we're going to watch a movie, but I don't know where exactly we're going to sleep or what we're going to eat, or, you know, what his dog is actually like. I don't know what time we're going to go to bed, how dark, you know, all of these things. I don't know. But so they can have that list actually on one piece of paper, maybe in one column and then the other column. Then through the night, through experience, you know, kids can start drawing a line. Now I know where I'm going to sleep. Now I know if we're going to have snacks. Now I know what movie we're going to watch, right? So they can start visually seeing through my own experience, I can answer my own questions. So that's essentially what's going on. Now, if you've got some big ticket things, they can start creating their own little book of wisdom where they're creating their own answers based on past experiences and lessons learned. Now, this is particularly important for our kiddos with executive functioning deficits, like kids with ASD or ADHD. They don't have that hindsight foresight, right? And that's oftentimes why solutions might seem so obvious to us, because we use, you know, our wisdom and experience, but they don't have that kind of thing. They're trapped in the now. And so us telling them based on our experiences of what to do, it's like, oh yeah, whatever, right? Yeah, mom, thanks, but no thanks. No one's going to listen. But if they can start creating their own answer bank, that's going to be really helpful. Having a coping card, again, just to remind them. So when they're in the heat of the moment of anxiety or a panic attack or anything like that, they can start coaching themselves. That's essentially what we need them to do, is to coach themselves. You're going to be a coach in the meantime, but for them to remind themselves, this is normal, it's temporary, right? It's just trying to get me to go back home, but I really want to do it. And these are the things that I could be doing. I love MacGyver. Like, I'm always telling my kids, how do we MacGyver the situation, right? I have no idea how it's going to work out, but I'm going to use what I've got to get through. My kids are terrified of avalanches, but I love going into like potential avalanche zones for skiing. It's so much fun Terrifies my kids though. I think that's the trap that I usually get into. I terrify my kids. That's another trap that we do as parents that builds anxiety. But you know, I have taken them into avalanche zones, don't go, but it's got the best snow. And so my kids learned, you know, I'm always saying resilience. And they're like, Mom, it's not resilience. You don't know what resilience is. But they do figure out what resources do I have to get down this double black diamond, you know, moguls that I can't even ski necessarily very well. They can figure it out, right? And my one daughter, yes, she had a panic attack in the middle of a ski hill. Best parenting, not my best parenting moment, maybe, but she figured it out. And now she knows what she can do. And she knows a lot about avalanche safety. They know a lot about cougar safety. There's a lot of things that they're able to figure out on their own. And it's through those experiences, figuring out those resources. We need to model as well, you know. We often don't, as parents, talk about our frustrations or things that are going on for us at work if we failed at something, right? We don't necessarily want to admit to those things, but that's how we got to be vulnerable for our kids, because otherwise they're never going to want to make mistakes, and they're always just going to have this perfection, and they're not going to know how to cope with their anxiety. So being able to say, I feel really frustrated. This thing happened at work. What can I do? Right? And let's problem solve together, because now I'm asking for help. That's something else that we don't model for our kids. So if you have a kiddo who isn't assertive and doesn't ask for help, we got to look at what we're modeling. If we're trying to hold all the brunt on our own shoulders, or let's work through this together. And we want to be able to do that too. They love being able to give input for us, and then they can see us as a mutual, you know, respectful partnership, right? And then they're more likely to come to you if they do have a problem. So, you know, or, you know, I do have a tough timeline for myself. I've got 5 things due actually probably earlier on this week that I'm leaving until tomorrow. But how do I plan this out, right? And so being able to talk through those things can be really important. I don't know what's going to happen, but this is how I'm going to plan it out to try to best prepare myself. We also need to look at flexibility, getting unstuck. And especially if you've got a kiddo who's quite rigid, this is really important, because now you've got the double whammy of rigidities, right? So it looks like anxiety's got you stuck. What little change can help you get unstuck? How can you figure that out, right? Rather than us telling them what to do, they need to start brainstorming different ways. And I love using different stories. So this is Michael Phelps. He is, no one will ever beat his world record of, you know, world medals and Olympic gold medals for swimming. But it was one of the Summer Olympics. I think it was 2008. I can't remember, or 2004. I can never remember. But anyways, one of the Olympics where his goggles actually broke. So he was swimming blind. And a lot of people, and even athletes at that level, would say, you know what, I did my best, you know, but they kind of throw in the towel, or they'll just give a half-hearted sort of performance because their goggles, they'll have some excuse, right? Why they couldn't do it, because their goggles were busted and they couldn't do it. He didn't. He was still, it was unpredictable, it was unexpected, and he just trusted in his own training. You know what? I think it was about 3 strokes in, so I know I've got 4 more to go, or however many, right? And then I'm going to do my flip at the end and come back. And he was able to trust, to pull from those inner resources. And guess what? Not only did he win the gold medal, he beat his world record for swimming anyways, and he was swimming blind. So we can use these examples. I also use this example from Friends. It's funny, I was never really that much into Friends, but I always use these as examples. So if you don't know this example, Rachel's not the best cook. She's one of the characters in the show, and she was trying to make a fruit trifle for dessert. And the recipe book, it got cut in half somehow. The pages got stuck together and ripped apart. And so she had part of the recipe for the trifle and part of a shepherd's pie. And so this is kind of what it ended up looking like. And, you know, she was all distraught and, oh, how horrible. But there was a silver lining. Joey will eat anything and thought it was delicious and ate the whole thing up. But things don't always go according to plan. So we got to be able to talk about those. Now, a lot of the times when we have kiddos who are quite rigid and inflexible, they avoid. I can't do it. I don't want to do it. I'm sick. I don't have time. For our younger kids, we see them controlling play. You must play my idea, for example. right? Otherwise, I can't do yours because I don't know if I'm going to be successful. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what the expectations are going to be. So with those rigidities, we start to avoid. But the only way that we can really overcome this, the next skill, is through experience. And I've talked a lot about creating opportunities and developing experience. When we avoid things we don't feel comfortable with, we lose the chance to practice and grow, right? So every time we avoid, we're limiting our opportunities to actually learn. And when we look at the brain, I always draw out the connections in the brain. So maybe you've got a kiddo who's amazing Minecraft. I draw a big thick line. You've had so much practice with Minecraft and you do it all the time. Practice, 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 practice makes perfect. Look at how strong your brain connection is for Minecraft. Over here, writing, you don't have much practice, so it's a little bit weaker, but we can strengthen that. Guess how? Through practice. But if we're avoiding it, and especially with our teens and young adults, guess what? The brain starts to prune itself. So if we're not using it, it's going to be even harder because our brain's going to cut off away all those connections in our brain. So it's going to be even harder. So we really need to be able to practice these things. 90% of what we learn is from what we experience. And so that's why we need to make sure that our kids are having these experiences to learn for themselves in the first place. But, they need to know going into it kind of what's going to happen. So when I talk about anxiety, when I talk about resilience, when I talk about self-regulation or emotion regulation, all of these things need opportunities. We try to protect our kids, but when we do that, we're not giving them opportunities to actually practice the skills they need to develop. And so one of the examples is they need to take risks, doing something brave, right? Being able to do those difficult things, that's more important than the actual outcome if they're actually successful. Well, maybe some of these examples, if you're jumping from a cliff, probably making it to the other side is pretty important. That outcome's important, but it's being able to go through that process is a lot more important than maybe getting an A+, for example, right? When kids have these experiences to cope with these challenges, they realize they can manage. They do have the capacity to succeed. But if we're always jumping in to help, they'll never have that experience that they can do it themselves, right? And so I usually give challenges, and maybe I'll get to that. So even when we look at how we travel the world, oftentimes we'll go on these, and Disneyland's awesome. I do love Disneyland. And I do like all-inclusive resorts once in a while as well, right? But when we're always doing that, I have I have a 9-year-old daughter, and she has a 9-year-old friend who's been to Mexico 10 times to the same resort, never been off the resort, right? And so we're really kind of isolating our kids, and then we'll send the messages, it's so dangerous outside of the resort. And maybe it is. This was actually right before COVID. I was very lucky to do this trip. I went to Southeast Asia with my youngest daughter. She was 8 at the time. She's 9 now. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, you're going to Southeast Asia by yourself with your daughter? I'm like, yeah, what's wrong, right? This is my ADHD. I don't think the world's scary. Everyone's like, it's such a scary world. But look at the experiences she had. We've been to Jamaica with the all-inclusive, and she had her own, hey, Bosco, go make me some fries and nachos and things like that. She had her own chef making her whatever she wanted around the clock. Here, though, what experiences we had, you can see in the one picture up in the right-hand corner, I think it's right for you guys, maybe it's left, there's a mosquito net. There's big holes in between the walls. It's just slats of wood and a big window opening. And yes, there was lots of bugs. We had to make sure that we were covering ourselves at night with the mosquito netting. She's chopping vegetables and chicken and things like that. There's no furniture in the house. She's sitting on the floor, but using these sharp utensils to cut up all the food for dinner. So she made dinner. She's learning how to get us down the river and just watching, this other little girl is doing some weaving. So amazing experiences, nothing that she could ever learn at school or anywhere else or any resort, right? It's through experiences. This is a big experience that we maybe shelter our kids from sometimes as well. So here's another one. Oh, you can have the audio. I don't know why. Here, let me see, because the audio is probably the best part of this. Share video, share screen. I don't know. still not great. I'll go back to the other one. So this is my daughter crossing the street. She wanted to film one of the big streets that were like 8 lanes across, and we had to essentially do Frogger all the way across 8 lanes of really busy traffic. But I didn't want her to film that. I was comfortable filming this one. And she's essentially saying, like, this is me crossing the road. And we have, if you look up, like, it's a green light. We actually have, as pedestrians, the right of way to cross the street. And this is what happened. So as you can see, she's like, "Whoa, sorry," right? So we're trying, that was just a little street. But the first time we were crossing, she was terrified. But by the end, like within, well, not even the end, within a couple of days, she's like, "Okay, I'm gonna video," and like looking around and frogging through all of this traffic, right? These experiences have been amazing, you know, and she used to have a lot of anxiety, but she's pretty resilient now. So this is me and her biking. We're lost. She and I said, "It's beautiful, we're biking," and my daughter said, "It's terrifying." Her bike essentially got busted, and so we're trying to figure out how to get her back, and we're lost, and we have no idea where we are. But these are the experiences. I always say adventure, and they're like, "Mom, your adventures are so scary." But we problem solve way through it. Okay, we only have one bike. We're pretty far out, so we need to ride a bike. We tried lots of different ways for her to be on the bike. You can see her hands pressing right into my shoulders because she really is terrified. It's uneven, unpaved ground, right? But we're problem solving. This is going to be the best way. Let's try this, let's try that until we figured it out, right? I didn't know either. I'd never been in this part of Vietnam, you know, and so there's lots of things that we had to work through. So it's these experiences that we give kids. So that's essentially it, giving them as many experiences, doing different things as we can, letting them fly to grandma and grandpa's house by themselves. They got to wait till they're 8, for example, but you know, doing these types of things that maybe we're not letting them do. So really it's coming down to exposure. Talking is not enough to change the brain, right? Doing is what makes stronger memories. Doing is through those experiences, and it's through those experiences how they learn. And they learn, I can cope with any situation and I can handle my anxiety. I didn't feel great, but I was able to do it. Now I feel great because I did it all by myself, right? So we have to have worry show up for that learning to happen. If they're not worried, they're not learning anything. You know, I had one kid who came in crying and he's like, "I'm older, I'm the big brother, my little sister, you know, she's so much braver than me because she's not scared of anything." That's not being brave. That's being fearless. That's being clueless, right? It's not learning. It's like, you know, if you see those cartoons where, you know, the little happy-go-lucky characters running along, and meanwhile behind them all this danger is happening because people are trying to protect them. They have no idea what's going on, right? It's being scared but being brave. But doing it anyway, that's what's being brave. So trying new things, stretching as much as possible. And the more you're doing this, and I give my parents every day, do something brave, stretch yourself outside of your comfort zone, even if it's doing a hard math problem or doing some writing, right? Things that you're not really comfortable with, ordering your own drink from Starbucks or whatever it is that you can be doing. I always tell parents, what are you doing for your kids that they could be doing for themselves? If they know how to use a phone, they know how to use a dryer and a washing machine, for example, right? So we got to get them doing lots of different things because otherwise they're going to continue to avoid. Now they're going to want to avoid. They might say, you might get fined and say, "Yeah, great plan, we've got a plan." But the minute you go into that situation, okay, we're going to go touch a dog. No, 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 not today, not today, not today. They're going to still feel uncomfortable and want to avoid. But we really need to make sure that we're going through with it, because otherwise, the minute we're like, "Okay, not today," oh, now we've actually worsened the anxiety because now they feel better. So I like to set it up as a series of experiments. We're going to go try this thing, right? I had a kiddo who was always scared of getting lost, for example, and he did get lost once, and he was able to problem solve. When you're in the heat of the moment, you got to figure it out. But I took him into my building. First time I met him, and it's a 3-story building, and I took him up to the top floor, and I blindfolded him, and I ran him to the end of the hallway and spun him around 3 times. I told him to count to 50, and I ran away. And I went right back to my office. I was going to stand in the hallways and things like that, but I'm like, well, no, because as soon as he sees me, he knows that someone's going to be there. His task was to get back to my office and figure it out. First time he'd ever met me in an unfamiliar building, and he's scared of getting lost. Now, just so you know, I got that buy-in beforehand. And he went to the end of the hallway and he didn't know where he was, right? But he problem solved, what am I going to do? So at first, he hadn't looked at numbers or anything like that. What he realized is I got to go right back to the beginning. And that's how he problem solved. He took the elevator right back to the ground floor, and he retraced his steps that he had taken with his parents to find my office, right? So it's these types of things, setting up little experiments, so they got to start problem solving and figuring things out on their own. And the more that we do that, we're building confidence. Oh, I was lost in that situation and I found my way back, right? So I'm going to persevere and I'm going to figure it out. I say choose your hard. Being anxious about the world and not doing things that you want to do and always avoiding situations and feeling really gross and yucky all the time is hard. So is doing the work, right? Doing the work is also hard. Making yourself uncomfortable is purpose. But I say, you got to choose your heart. Which one's more important to you? And a lot of my young adults will say, you know what? I don't want to live like this anymore. So you got to find that for the kids as well. And I say that to parents too. You got to choose your heart. You got to do the work too to support your kids. So you can keep walking on eggshells, right? That's hard. But if you do this work and a little bit of practice every day, it will get easier over the long term, right? So the exposure, it's collaborating, focusing on what they want, you know, and what they want to learn, trying to figure out. And then predicting, when is it going to show up? What is it going to say? What is it going to make you feel like, right? What are others going to do? I think that's really important. This is what I'm going to do if we're getting sucked, so we don't get sucked in, right? I'm not going to ignore it. Now, the one thing is we don't want to end exposure until anxiety decreases. And so I talk about this white knuckling. So the elevator is a perfect example. You can get onto an elevator and close your eyes and scrunch yourself up and hold your fists and be like, just 3 more floors, 2 more floors, 1 more floor, and then you get off and you're like, oh. Guess what? We've just reinforced anxiety. Yes, you went on that elevator, but you were anxious the whole time. You didn't feel relaxed until you got off of that elevator. Guess what? We just made anxiety worse. So you need to be able to be on that elevator relaxed. And the more we can pair relaxed state with that anxiety provoking stimulus, or even fun state, maybe you're having a party and having your favorite treat in the elevator, I don't know, pairing with something positive, then we're going to start changing our brain wiring. Just going to check the time here where we are. So essentially we're creating new habits, and when we're creating new habits, we are actually changing our brain. So the thing that we need to know too is when we are starting to expose our kids to anxiety, the anxiety will get worse before it gets better. So they need to habituate, right? So we want to be able to decrease. So this is kind of what it looks like. Even with behaviors, the same thing is true. As soon as we change how we're reacting and responding to our kids' behavior, there's going to be some pushback. So it's going to increase. But when they realize, oh, nothing bad's going to happen, actually, this is going good, then we'll see it kind of go off. So it's being able to survive that kind of explosion of what's happening with the anxiety. So it will get worse just in the attempt, because the anxiety doesn't want to let go of its cult, right? It's going to hold on to its cult. But as soon as we realize, no, we can get out of it on our own, then it's a lot easier. So stretching, doing the opposite of what anxiety wants, doing the opposite of what you would normally do, right? Doing of what worry expects and what worry wants you to do. Those are the types of things that we need to start doing, but we need to make sure that we're creating opportunities, whether it's for ourselves or for, and that's true too, for anyone who has anxiety, who's watching this too, it's you creating opportunities. If you don't want to live like this anymore, it's being brave every day on purpose, right? So what is it that I can do? If I'm a perfectionist, I'm going to work on being, it's okay. I'm going to hand in something that's just good enough. I've got a big webinar series that I'm creating right now, and I've been stressing over, and it's gotten to the point I had wanted to hand it in on Monday. It's gotten to the point, you know what? It's got to be as good as it gets. And if you talk to brain surgeons, We would hope that brain surgeons were perfect, but if you talk with them, they're like, there is no room for perfection. You want to get in that brain and out of that brain as quickly as possible. It's got to be good enough, because if you're playing around to get it perfect, the chances of you messing up big time are really good. Or if you've ever done a painting or a drawing, right, and the eye is a little bit messed up and you go try to fix it and it just gets worse, you probably should have left it in the first place. You want to have some of those experiences, but being able to persist, doing those types of things. One of the things I like to do is give challenges. And so I'll give, for younger kids, well, even for old, I've done this with teachers too. I'll give them riddles, and they need to persist to try to figure it out on their own. And even my teachers, my adults that I do these webinars with, they're like, oh my gosh, just give us the answer already, right? It's too hard. I don't know. We want the answer right away, or we want hints. So one of the examples that I give, maybe I'll give an easy one and then a hard one. The easy one you might be able to get. I'm not going to give you the answer to both. If you want them, you're going to have to reach out to me. But with the correct answer, I'm not going to give you any hints. The first one is, you've got, or let's say I've got 2 coins in my pocket that add up to 35 cents. But one of the coins is not a dime. What do I have? That one you might be able to figure out fairly quickly. But kids sometimes will get really upset. I don't know what the answer is right away, and then they give up. So that's the one. If you know the answer, you can shout it out. I don't have the chat going, but you can shout it out if you're a smarty pants. The other thing is, so another riddle that I often give my kids is, a guy gets onto a plane, and as he gets onto his plane, he sees his friend sitting a few seats away. He immediately greets his friend and is immediately arrested. Why? Now, I've literally given that to some of my kids and they start crying right away because they don't know the answer right away. And that's that persistence piece. And it's too hard, I can't do it. So I say, you're not allowed to leave my office until you ask me 5 to 10, or I'll give them a specific number, depending on the severity of how upset the child is. Sometimes I only ask for 5, sometimes I'll ask for 10. 10 questions. Yes or no questions. You don't have to answer it. You're not going to answer it. It might take you months to answer it, but yes or no questions. And then I will only answer with yes or no. I will not say, oh, you're so close. I will not give any hints at all, because people want hints, and we always give clues to our kids. But when we do that, they're not really solving it on their own, and they're not really persevering. So they're always expecting just a little bit of help, just a little bit of hints, just a little bit of support. And it's those types of things that really make it hard for them to be able to have these opportunities to do it on their own. So that's something that you want to make sure, we want to create. Those are little things that you could even be doing now. So if you can't be going out in public during COVID or anything like that, we can start stretching every day, little things like that, working on those kinds of challenges. Now, the one thing that we need to remember is right next to our amygdala, that little almond in our brain, so it's kind of in between like this green, the arrow there, right next to that amygdala is our hippocampus, which is our memory stores, and it regulates memory and emotions. So guess what? Our amygdala really processes our negative emotions, the worrisome events, right? And our hippocampus is right there. So what will we always remember? We will always remember in perfect detail the negative things, the bad things that have happened to us. It's really hard to remember the good things, and good things that we do remember are usually false memories. If you look at the research, we don't remember them how it actually happened. We are most able, in the greatest detail, able to remember the negative. So our brain really is like Velcro to those negative things. So we need to be able to detach that a little bit. And as soon as we're remembering, hard times, again, our prefrontal cortex goes offline. So we could be doing things like, that's why I talk about bringing up our successes and learning and talking about happy times and all of those types of things. Now, there can be situations that had happened even as a baby or when we were really young that we have no recollection of. We might not actually remember them, but they're so ingrained in our brain. That's why, we might have kids who are terrified of clowns, for example. That's such a big thing right now. you know, one little event, and now all of a sudden it's just terrifying, right? And we might not even be conscious of where those things happened. And oftentimes parents get caught in why are they so anxious? Why are they so scared? But sometimes we have no idea. Maybe, you know, if they're terrified of dogs, who knows? Maybe one day the phone rang and there was a dog on the screen of the TV and the phone had startled them, but that's what they saw. And now there's this implicit memory that they can't remember, but it ingrained something. Who knows, right? It could be something random. But worry makes us forget. And it makes us forget the good, and it also makes us forget our successes that we've already had. And so we just continue worrying again. And so, you know, there's one example of a little girl who's doing ski jumping. I always share the same example, but she's doing ski jumping and she had done the 20, you know, if you think of COP, the little jumps, the little ski jumps, and she could do those, could do those, could do those. But now she was doing the 60-foot jump. And she had one of those GoPro cameras on her camera, and you can hear the terror in her voice, like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And she's like right high pitched and she's on the verge of tears. And then you can hear her coach, you know, it's just a bigger 20. It's just a bigger 20. Because she's jumped hundreds of times before, but worry made her forget that this is the exact same thing that I've done hundreds of times before. It's just a bigger 20. And so you could hear her then saying, it's just a bigger 20, it's just a bigger 20, it's just a bigger 20, right? And she's saying that to herself. She's still terrified out of her mind. She's still on the verge of tears, but that was enough to get her going. And right when she started going, you could hear the terror. And then she realized, it's just a bigger 20. I've got this. And you could actually hear just in how she changes, I've got this, where that confidence comes in. She does her jump, she lands, and she's cheering. It was amazing on the other side, right? But that anticipation, that worry makes us forget that I'm a pro at this. I know exactly what I need to do. So we need to create memory bridges for our kids, from our past successes to our current challenges. And so I love these Venn diagrams. So we can have a success journal, but these Venn diagrams. So, you know, on the one side, we've got all the things that could be hard. And on the right-hand side, all the successes that we have. And then in the middle is, this is what we're working on, right? And I love sticky notes. So you can put everything that's hard on a sticky and then you move it over. So today we're gonna work on dogs, for example, or we're gonna work on puzzles or writing or reading new people, whatever it is that's hard. And as we move it over to the success, we can actually see our progress. And we're reminding our brain, look it, I can be successful. I can do it on my own. I am very capable. Now, I just want to go through, I mean, a lot of this, it really comes down to exposure and experience and being on offense. I do want to talk a little bit about breathing, because breathing and strategies like this are the typical strategies that people will give you. Now, yes, breathing's important, but guess what? All of us need to breathe. If any of us stopped breathing, we would die. Breathing is important, absolutely, right? But it's a reset button. It's not a treatment on its own. And if you've ever told a child or even another adult, just calm down, just breathe, I am calm. That's usually the response you're going to get. Then you might get kids who are going to try to breathe, but they're breathing really shallowly. Now, I do have some kids who are really good at breathing and really good at regulating that, but they haven't gotten too far up their emotional dysregulation ladder, right? They're not too far gone. So there are moments, if you're low enough, that you can do breathing. And deep breathing is really important because it does help get that oxygen flow to the brain and the different brain areas. Now, it's the exhalation breath that's the most. The inhalation breath is quite stimulating to the brain. And so that's why if we start to hyperventilate, we're actually stimulating the brain and making anxiety worse. So it's the exhalation that's the most important. So if we're going to do breathing, it's blowing out at least twice as long as what we're going in. Now, breathing is definitely important, especially for kiddos or individuals with chronic anxiety and stress, because it changes their breathing pattern to the point that even at nighttime, they're breathing shallowly. And then that's really problem because they're never breathing optimally, even at sleeping time. So breathing is important, but I say practice breathing when you're calm. It's just a good thing to be doing before bedtime, right? When there are no worries, when you're calm, engaging in that deep breathing so you can help reset the breathing. That's what we want to do. Exercise is really important. No one is meant to sit all day. Kids, adults, nobody's meant to sit all day. Even just stretching and yawning can really help reduce stress. And exercise actually, it's shown to really help with anxiety. It helps with serotonin and the melatonin. Melatonin helps us get to sleep. It helps us relax and tires out our muscles. And it just, it supports that sleep piece, but also addresses anxiety. So exercise just has to be part of the treatment plan. Now, there's also things, you got to find what can just put a smile on your face. So if cute little animals or babies with baby animals, if those are cute and cuddly, you're just like, ah, right? You got to have those moments. Now, I did do the Macarena earlier on today. Usually when I have my big group, I add other activities like other singing and dancing. I have everyone sing Sweet Caroline. You got to find these things just to have, even if it's little pockets of times through the day where you can have little stress-free, breaks, relaxation breaks, little laughs, that can help as well, right? We can create new rituals. So every day is a new day. Wipe away yesterday, wash your hands. We're washing our hands so much. Wipe away whatever stress and just take that moment to take a deep breath, right? Creating those kinds of rituals. Mindfulness is really important, and we're actually finding that it is quite effective with executive functioning deficits, so ADHD and autism. And really with the mindfulness, it's focusing on the acceptance, because the big thing with anxiety is we want to try to push our thoughts away and push these feelings away. But we have these sort of brain, I can't remember the term right off the top of my head right now. I always have it. I just don't have it right now. But our brain, essentially, it just processes the opposite of what we want it to do. So if I say, don't think of a white bear, whatever you do, do not think of a white bear. The first thing that's going to pop into your mind is a white bear. So as soon as we start thinking, I got to get to sleep, I got to get to sleep, I got to get to sleep, we're stressing about it, guess what? We're never going to fall asleep, right? And so that's kind of what ends up happening. And so, it starts with an I. It's right on the tip of my tongue. But as soon as we try to start changing those things, it can be really problematic. So with mindfulness, it's really accepting, here's my anxiety. Yep. Right. And that's kind of what I've been talking about. Here you are, right? Being on offense. I know you're here, but this is my plan. This is what I'm going to do even still. So mindfulness can just help with some of those things. And even just sitting with your anxiety, just sitting with that panic attack that's washing over you. Right. And I do with panic attacks, I will actually elicit panic attacks in my room, especially with my young adults who think that they're going to have a heart attack. I got to sit down, I got to rest. And I will get them up and I will do plyometrics. They are jumping jacks and touching their knees, and we're running on the spot and we're elevating that heart rate so that they can realize, and I ask, is a dead person, a person who's dying, be able to do jumping jacks? Well, no, right? And it's not until they have that experience doing it, okay, I really am not going to die, right? We also got to look at screens. Now, I've talked about screens a little bit, but right before bedtime is really important because it affects the melatonin in our brain, which means we're not able to fall asleep as easily. And then if we're not getting good sleep, guess what? We can't cope with our anxiety, right? So just having really good nighttime routines are going to be really important. Now, the other thing is with screens, it's not just about the melatonin. Screens also increase that cortisol into our bodies, right? So we're exposed to fearful images and stories and things like that. And that cortisol is going to be running, they're taking that to sleep, right? And they're not going to be able to use any brain power to overcome any of the anxiety that's going on because they're just kind of sucked in there. So Fast and Furious, I was able to get through quite a lot. Those are some things you want to try. Get out of those parent traps that you're doing. Essentially, you want to become a coach, right? Rather than telling your kids or reassuring, it's like, oh, kiddo, that's a tough situation. Or yeah, that makes sense that you're feeling like that. This is what's happening in your body. So what are you going to do? What's the plan, right? And then I'm here to help you. You can say that. What is my role in this? how can I help you? Then if they ask for your advice, then you can give it. But otherwise, they need to be able to ask for that help. If you're still having trouble, then it was probably worthwhile getting some help, because you don't want to leave it too long. The longer you do, and if, you know, especially as they're getting older into teenage years, young adult years, they're more vulnerable to developing anxiety disorder if they don't already have one. That leads to depression and a whole host of other difficulties that could be irreversible later on. Now, even if you are an adult, it's not to say irreversible in terms of you can't still treat your anxiety. Absolutely you can. You just got to work a little bit harder. And so when I say at least, you know, while we're still young adults or younger, it's a lot easier to tackle a lot of these things. But certainly, I mean, I was someone who had a lot of anxiety until I was an adult and learned a lot of the strategies that I needed, exercise being one huge component of that, and then problem solving and experience that I know that I can handle these things. Those are all still important. You just got to work a little bit harder. So this is probably the first time ever I've actually finished with a few minutes to spare. I actually just got a text saying, hopefully, couldn't hear the sound on video. Hopefully you were able to hear me here, but I would love to open the floor to any questions that you might have. You can add them into the chat. I do have, actually, I'll put my information here. So if you're watching a recording of this or you don't have a chance to ask your question now, definitely reach out to me. Feel free to email me. Just so you know, I am drowned in emails, so it might take me a few days to get back to you, but I promise I will get back to you. I think that that's just really important. So feel free to add any questions if you have any in the chat, or feel free to get in touch with me.